My name is Mike Lewin, and I'm running for borough president. In this video, I'd like to address one common argument against new housing. The argument is, well, if we build new market rate housing, it'll be bought up by these oligarchs from China or Russia who will just use the condos as safe deposit boxes in the sky and never even rent them out. And so this argument is kind of an unusual challenge to traditional supply and demand arguments because it doesn't reject the idea that the law of supply and demand applies to housing. Instead, the argument is that new housing isn't likely to increase housing supply. So I am responding to this essentially with a PowerPoint. So this is, be aware, this is going to be one of the longer and more scholarly videos. And so let's share screen. And so I call this PowerPoint in defense of supertalls because the arguments that, or excuse me, the apartments that get criticized the most tend to be extremely tall buildings. Like, for example, 432 Park Avenue, a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now. So let me describe the argument in more detail. So the argument is that if you allow new housing, it really won't increase housing supply because it will be bought by all these rich foreigners. And as I said, this argument is especially common regarding supertalls like 432 Park. And so the theory is that places like 432 Park are so expensive that they're not really affordable to local residents. And furthermore, the argument also implies that this is really typical of new market rate housing. The new market rate housing is always too expensive for New Yorkers. So what's wrong with this? I think the biggest flaw or the most obvious flaw in the argument to me is it implies that all new housing is too expensive for locals. In fact, even the most expensive new housing is affordable at least to what I would call the ordinary rich in New York. What do I mean by that? Well, let's imagine what I think of as somebody who's very affluent, but who is much more common in New York than billionaires, by which, for example, a partner in a large law firm like Kraft Swain, Sherman and Sterling. As you walk through Midtown office buildings, you can see their names all over. So partners in these kind of buildings, these kind of law firms often make $5 million a year. So how much can you afford on $5 million? Well, certainly you can be able to afford, say, $100,000 a month for a condo or for an apartment, or you can afford to pay $120,000 per month in a mortgage payment. If you do either of those things, less than 30% of your income is going to rent or the mortgage. And so these sorts of dollar figures, although they frankly to me are sort of astounding because they're roughly comparable to my year's salary, even these large sums are actually more than what you might have to pay for at least some units in buildings like 432 Park. That is to say, a mortgage payment for a two-bedroom at 432 Park costs $60,000. So if you happen to be in a large law firm, if you happen to be a partner in a large law firm, yes, you can afford to live in 432 Park. You might not want to because there are plenty of perfectly nice buildings that are much less expensive, but you could if you wanted to. You could qualify for a mortgage. Furthermore, the argument that I'm criticizing, the argument, all the new condos are supertalls that nobody can afford, actually implies that most new housing is as expensive as 432 Park. In fact, the overwhelming majority of new condos are much less expensive than most of the units, or even any of the units at 432 Park. That is to say, only about 1/3 cost over $5 million. The median, just from looking at Zillow, is probably in the $2, $3, $4 million range. Now, these are still way above my pay grade. But even so, again, if you're kind of an ordinary rich person, if you're a finance guy who's earning maybe $500,000 a year, you can afford these new condos. So another issue is, Well, to what extent are these in fact used as safe deposit boxes in the sky? That is to say, to what extent are these new buildings actually not rented out or not used by their owners? Well, we really don't have any study in New York. I mean, we have anecdotal evidence. You know, the New York Times likes to claim in news stories, well, you know, half of these condos are dark. But really, this is not my idea of just kind of a random guess from a New York Times reporter. Is not my idea of peer-reviewed scholarship. It's not even my idea of non-peer-reviewed scholarship. And we do have one study from London, which to me is somewhat similar to New York in the sense that it's a city attractive to foreign investors. In fact, London is probably much more attractive to foreign investors than New York because it's a lot closer to Russia and China and all of Europe. So a study from some scholars at the London School of Economics found that in London's luxury buildings that about less than 1% of new luxury units were left completely empty. And in fact, only 20% of new housing in London was foreign owned. And most of the units that were owned by foreigners were rented to Londoners. In fact, I have personal experience with this. From 2019 to 2021, I lived in a building at 39th and 5th. It was a 34-story condo, and I rented from somebody who was, well, actually, she lives in New Jersey now, but she was not born in the United States. Having said that, it's certainly not a typical super tall. It was only 34 stories and it was built in the 80s. So a second problem with the concern about, oh, foreigners are taking over the city is that it assumes that not building new condos is better than building new condos. And what's wrong? What's wrong with that is this. Even if the basic factual claim was true, even if you assume for the sake of argument that every new condo unit in the city was bought by an oligarch from China, and that not one of these units was rented to a New Yorker, even so, these buildings would be good for the market. Why? Because these new buildings reduce demand for the older buildings, making them less expensive than they otherwise would be. Why do I say that? Because if you don't build these expensive buildings, it doesn't make the rich people go away. It just means they buy older units instead and bid up the price of those older units. Well, why do I think that? How do we know this? Well, to me, it's just economic common sense. What I mean by that is, if you're an investor whose goal is to make profits rather than to live in a building, why do you care whether your building was built in 2020 or 1920? All you want is something that's likely to appreciate, whether it's an 80-story tall new building or in a 4-story West Village walk-up. In fact, West Village walk-up might be a better bet because those have a history of appreciation. Whereas with a new building, you never know what's going to go wrong. In fact, I recently read a bunch of stories about maintenance failures at 432 Park. So actually for Mr. and Mrs. Oligarch, 432 Park might actually be a riskier bet than a historic building in the West Village. Furthermore, we have some evidence from other cities. Paris has strict height limits in its historic areas. Basically, there's almost nothing higher than 4, 5, 6 stories in these neighborhoods. And so if new buildings were the problem, you'd have no out-of-town investment in Paris. Basically, there would be about as many out-of-town buyers in Paris as you would have in Billings, Montana. But in fact, out-of-town investment is as common as in New York City. So that's evidence to me that just having old, short buildings doesn't really keep out the out-of-town rich people. And of course, when the rich foreigners buy up the older units, that means fewer apartments and condos for the rest of us. In other words, if you didn't have any new condos, then all these rich foreigners, however many of them they are, would just be bidding up the price of the older condos. And so that's why, as a renter, I actually have a self-interest in lots of new condos. There's one other point I'd like to make. Even if this entire argument made sense, even if it was true that that rich foreigners were buying up all these new condos and that new condos therefore didn't do anything to increase housing supply, It only applies to condos. That is to say, it doesn't make sense for rich foreigners to use rental units as safe deposit boxes because nobody makes money from renting out an apartment and not subletting it. So in other words, even if this entire argument makes sense, it would only be an argument against condos and not an argument against rental. But in reality, not in my backyard resistant to housing is just as common for apartments as it is to rental units. Or to put it another way, if somebody uses this argument as essentially a NIMBY argument, as an argument against upzoning, ask them, well, would you accept an upzoning if it was just reserved for rental units as opposed to condos? And I suspect that 99 times out of 100, they'd say no. 99 times out of 100, they'd find another excuse to oppose the upzoning. So you may be asking at this point, hey, wait a minute, let's suppose that there is no foreign investment. Let's suppose all these condos were purchased by the native rich or by the native upper middle class. How does it help those of us who can't afford these condos? As to say, let's say you have a bunch of condos that were affordable to people earning $200,000 a year, which is roughly the income of 2 law professors. So it's not, even though it's still more than I make, it's not quite that insanely out of my reach. Well, how does that help those of us who earn, say, $75,000 a year? And so I address this argument in video 7 in much more detail, but let me give you a brief summary of the argument. Let's imagine that there's 5 groups of people. Rich, so imagine the law firm partner earning $5 million a year. Kind of rich, so imagine somebody who earns maybe $400,000 a year, someone who maybe might be able to afford the cheaper new condos. Middle class, which I'm going to pretend is me, and poor, which is everybody who's poorer than me, or even people who are really poor if you like. It doesn't really matter. So what happens if you have a bunch of new apartments for rich people? Well, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that the new apartments are just for rich people and the rich people like them and the rich people move to the new apartments. Well, what happens to the apartments that are left behind by the rich people? Well, the people in the second category, the kind of rich, move to the richest left behind apartments. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them. And then what happens to the apartments that are left over abandoned by the people who are kind of rich? Well, those apartments don't stay vacant forever. They may stay vacant for a while because landlords don't really know yet what they can get away with. And some landlords still maybe hold on to the hope that some kind of rich people will move in. But eventually, over time, some of these apartments are going to be taken over by the middle class. And so then that means they're middle class apartments that are now vacant. And eventually, some of the middle class's apartments are going to be taken over by the poor. And that in turn means there are more apartments left over for the poor. The poor have more bargaining power. So eventually, even at the very bottom of the economic chain, there's going to be more of a housing surplus than there otherwise would be. Now, of course, all of this happens when housing supply is added. The reason it hasn't been very much in New York is in New York, there really hasn't been housing supply growth. That is to say, housing supply growth has consistently, as I've pointed out in earlier videos, lagged behind job growth. And that's the root of our problem. So on that note, see you on the campaign trail.